Hello and welcome to the Accuplacer Sentence Skills Prep review of sentence basics. Now, you might remember at one time or another hearing a definition of a sentence that sounds something like this. A sentence is a group of words with a verb, a subject, and a sense of completeness. Let's take a look at this with an actual example. Okay, so here we have a sentence, the factory manufactures appliances. The verb is manufactures. That's the action that's happening in the sentence. Factory is the subject. That's the person or thing that's doing the manufacturing. And finally, there's a sense of completeness with this sentence. The sentence isn't structured as though there was more information to come. The sentence makes one point and the reader isn't left hanging, wondering or waiting for more information. So we'll take a look at each of these parts of a sentence or criteria for a sentence in a little more depth, starting with verbs. A verb is a word that names or describes a physical or mental action. And verbs are key building blocks of sentences. They're essential to convey a piece of information. Some examples of verbs, here are some examples, that name physical actions. These are things that you can observe. Walk, jump, cough, laugh, breathe, smile. There are also verbs that fall into this category of a mental action. They're not actions that you can observe, but they are things that we do. We can do this with our mind or mental action. Think, dream, love, fear, dread, question. One of the most common kinds of verbs that we see are forms of the verb to be. And those are words like is, am, are, and was. And finally, we often run into in sentences helping verbs. These are forms of to be that assist verbs that are in the ing or ed form. So some helping verbs that we often see are am, were, will be, and was. Sometimes we're not sure if a word is actually working as a verb in a sentence. Here's a quick test you can try to see if a word is in fact a verb. Try putting the word he or they in front of it. For example, we could try the word saving. If we say he saving, it sounds awkward, and we know that ing verbs or ing words can't work as verbs by themselves. They need helping verbs. So saving, in this case, is not a verb. So now let's look at dreamed. He dreamed. This works. It's expressing a thought or an idea, and it makes sense. One of the things you have to be careful with ed words is sometimes they're working as adjectives in the sentence. So you want to pay particularly close attention to the context of your sentence and make sure that the main action that you're describing is in fact this ed word. Next we have needs, and needs is a verb describing a mental action. He needs. So needs passes our test, and it is in fact the verb in the sentence. Now we have to try. He to try. And this sounds awkward, and we can tell that what we have right here is an infinitive. It's a verb that hasn't been conjugated yet. So verbs in the infinitive form, that's the to form, are never actually the verbs in use in a sentence. They're the words that are described verbs or name verbs, but they haven't yet been conjugated, so they're not actually being used as verbs when they have a to before them in a sentence. Now we have is painting. And it's true that painting is an ing word, but it has the helping verb is in front of it. So he is painting is fine. It's a complete verb. So to find the subject of a sentence, you first need to identify the verb and then locate who or what is performing the action that the verb describes. So here's an example. The acrobat tumbled across the mat. If we look, we can find the verb is tumbled. That describes a physical action. And the person doing the tumbling is the acrobat. So acrobat is the subject of the sentence. There are several points you're going to want to keep in mind when you're looking for the subject of a sentence. The first is that a subject can be either a noun or a pronoun. For example, in this sentence, the comet's tail disintegrated. The comet's tail is a noun, and it's the subject of disintegrated. We can also use the pronoun it. It might be standing in for the comet's tail, and it could be the subject also of the verb disintegrated. Another point to keep in mind is that the subject of a verb is never the object of a preposition. In other words, it's never the noun that follows a preposition. Here's an example. After dark scares me. We can't use dark as a subject here because it's part of the prepositional phrase after dark. Instead, we'd need to eliminate that preposition after and just simply state the dark scares me. Also, a third point you want to keep in mind is that sometimes verbs in the ing form can actually function as the subject of a sentence. You already know that verbs in the ing form can't function as verbs alone. But here's an example. They can function, however, as subjects. And here's an example. Sailing is an exciting sport. Sometimes a group of words has a subject and a verb, but it's structured in a way that makes it seem incomplete, resulting in a sentence fragment. One type of fragment is a group of words with a subject and verb that begin with a dependent word. You want to watch out for relative pronouns like that, which, and who, because clauses beginning with these words are dependent, and a sentence needs at least one independent clause, one subject and verb that can stand by itself. So even though that, which, and who clauses can be added to independent clauses, they can't stand all by themselves as sentences. So here's an example. That the children visited last week doesn't make sense. It can't stand by itself. Which the children visited last week. Again, we have visited and children, but this word which at the beginning suggests more information is coming. And who the children visited last week. It's the same problem. A verb visited, the children is the subject, but the who at the beginning suggests more information is coming in the sentence, so it makes the sentence incomplete. Another type of dependent words is the subordinating conjunction. These are words like while, because, when, since, and although. And we use these a lot to begin clauses that help add information to a sentence. The problem is that clauses beginning with these words are dependent. They can't stand by themselves, and a sentence needs at least one independent clause. So be on the lookout for clauses that begin with these words. For example, while Ms. Skelly danced last week. We have the verb danced, we have the subject Ms. Skelly, but while suggests more information is coming, so it's in fact incomplete. Likewise, when Ms. Skelly danced last week, suggests that more information is coming, and since there isn't any, this also is an incomplete sentence. Since Ms. Skelly danced last week, although Ms. Skelly danced last week, and because Ms. Skelly danced last week are all examples of the same problem. They are clauses with subjects and verbs, but they begin with a dependent word that does not allow them to stand by themselves. There's no sense of completeness. One way you can check for completeness for a group of words is to try plugging it into the sentence below. He refused to accept the idea that. If what follows makes sense, then what you have is a complete sentence. But if the resulting sentence doesn't make sense, then what you have is not a complete sentence. So let's try out our first example. Dogs bark. He refused to accept the idea that dogs bark. This makes sense, and even though it's only 2 words, dogs bark, it is a complete sentence. Now let's try dogs bark at night. He refused to accept the idea that dogs bark at night. This makes sense, so dogs bark at night is a complete sentence. Now let's try dogs nearby. He refused to accept the idea that dogs nearby. This doesn't make sense, and in fact, this isn't a complete sentence because it lacks a verb. Now we'll try after dogs bark. He refused to accept the idea that after dogs bark. This doesn't sound right, and it isn't a sentence because even though there is the verb bark and the subject dogs, the dependent word after makes the sentence sound as though there's more information coming, and there isn't. So this is actually a sentence fragment. Finally, we have continually barking. He refused to accept the idea that continually barking. This doesn't sound right or make sense, and in fact, we have an ing verb without a helping verb and no subject, so continually barking is not a sentence. So let's practice what we've just learned. Try to identify which of the following is a sentence. Ice melts. Ice melts is a sentence. It has a verb melts, a subject ice, and a sense of completeness. We can plug it into our test sentence. He refused to accept the idea that ice melts, and it makes sense. So this is, in fact, a complete sentence, even though it's only 2 words. Beneath the tree. Beneath the tree is not a sentence. To start with, there is no verb. Beneath is a preposition, but there's no word in this group of words that describes an action or names an action. So if there's no verb, there can't be a subject, and the sense of completeness is irrelevant. Beneath the tree is not a sentence. Having several options. Okay, we start by looking for a verb. We have the ing having, but no helping verb. And we know that verbs in the ing form have to have a helping verb. So there is no verb, and there can't be a subject if there isn't a verb. So this is not a sentence. Having several options is not a sentence. Now we have this long group of words making a point of showing his displeasure. And we might feel like because this is such a long group of words, it must be a sentence. But we start out, as usual, looking for the verb, and we see making, but it's an ing verb with no helping verb. So there's no other word in this group that describes an action, so there's no verb. If there's no verb, there's no subject. So even though this is a long group of words, it is not a sentence. Our last example here is although the recorder malfunctioned. Now, we can find a verb in this sentence, malfunctioned, and we do find a subject, someone or something that's doing the malfunctioning, the recorder. The problem here is there isn't a sense of completeness because that word although suggests that there's more coming in the sentence. Although the recorder malfunctioned, we expect to hear something else. So because we don't hear something else, this is actually a sentence fragment, an incomplete sentence, because it lacks a sense of completeness. To practice or review examples of the types of questions on the Accuplacer, view the Accuplacer Sentence Skills Test Prep Tutorials 1 and 2. You can also learn more about specific types of sentence errors in the Sentence Snarls tutorial.